Good morning. Welcome to Sustainability Beyond the Rhetoric. On behalf of the whole team at Business in the Community Ireland, I am delighted to welcome you and thank you for your interest and your participation this morning. Before we get going, let's go first and foremost to some housekeeping. Very simple rules for this morning. First and foremost, this session is being recorded. Secondly, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's the main channel of communication with us during the next hour. The other function is disabled, so please, if you have any questions, comments, compliments, complaints, or if you have any technical issues, please use the Q&A box. Third and final, in terms of social media, hashtag Beyond the Rhetoric for those of you who are very active in that space, and we so much welcome and encourage all types of participation online and offline. So as I was saying, you're all very welcome. And for those of you who do not know or have engaged with Business in the Community before, we are a movement of over 100 of Ireland's largest companies. We strongly believe in business in the community, in a low carbon, sustainable, fair and inclusive Ireland. And we clearly believe that business can play a fundamental role in this transition towards an inclusive and low carbon economy. And that's what we do with these companies every day, working individually on their practices and their policies, but also using our collective voice to drive further high the standards for sustainability to happen. So, as I was saying, today is the first of a series of 3 webinars that we have called Sustainability Beyond the Rhetoric. And this is not a webinar like many of the others you have been before. This is a session where we want to open the bonnet and have a look inside and really find out what is going on in business. What are the practical, real tools and processes that are happening that are making companies really embed sustainability across their organizations. And we're going to do a tour of 3 days looking at 3 key dimensions: environmental, social, and governance, ESG. But this is ESG without the jargon. So we'll see how we can play on that jargon challenge that we have in front of us. So in terms of an agenda, let's have a look at what we have for this morning, which is our environmental session. And obviously, I don't need to remind you the sense of urgency that although this is very much about practical and this is very much about solutions, we don't need to forget the sense of urgency that is out there. From a social and from an environmental perspective, this is critical. So we're delighted that yesterday we launched our significant piece of research on Scope 3 emissions and how companies that have signed up to our low carbon pledge will be entering into that journey towards more meaningful target setting. And just as a reminder, 58 of our members that you saw on that slide earlier have signed up to the pledge. We're delighted that Minister Eamon Ryan is going to give some of the context setting for what we're going to be discussing this morning, and it's obviously important to get his input and his endorsement on this piece of work and how it fits with the programme for government and the draft climate action bill that it's being debated as we speak. Unfortunately, Minister Ryan wanted to be with us, but this is one of those weeks, and he's in the depths of discussing and debating the budget. So he has left an address that I'll introduce in a second. Immediately afterwards, I'll leave you in the hands of my colleague, Cillian McMahon, and he's going to lead a debate and a conversation with 3 companies that will tell us about their journey in real, practical and concrete ways. So I'm delighted that Sky, Britvic and Arup are joining us this morning. And immediately after the debate, we're going to hear from our research partners, Quantis, who carried out the very thorough research to really understand what are those Scope 3 emissions, why are they so relevant, and how do we get into a meaningful process of setting targets and aligning business action with what is expected in terms of the Paris Agreement and of the low carbon challenges that have been set by the EU and by Ireland. So before I bring this to the next step, which is to introduce the Minister, I'd just like to share two reflections in terms of the environmental conversation that we're having this morning. The hottest month of September ever on record, 1/5 of biodiversity at risk of extinction. The headlines keep on coming and keep on alerting us. If you haven't seen the Attenborough film, it's a must-see in terms of what this journey has been and what the challenges are out there. So if it's not now, when are we going to take action? That is a question that we all need to ask ourselves. Clearly, we're going to discuss this morning about the carbon agenda, but I don't want this to be singled out in terms of carbon. We also need to remember the biodiversity crisis that we have in front of us, the water crisis, and the big challenges in terms of waste and circular economy. But obviously, there's endless solutions, and that is the exciting part about these conversations, the solutions and the innovation that is coming. And the final thought I'll leave you with is, this is very much about an interconnected agenda. Although today's day E, tomorrow is day S, and Friday will be day G, all these dimensions are interconnected. Let's not forget that there is a people dimension to this low carbon agenda. It's very much about the just transition, something we're discussing right here, right now, in terms of carbon taxes and the new budget. There's also an investor dimension and an access to capital dimension that we're discussing on Friday, but it's very much interconnected with this environmental agenda. So that's why it is so critical, and that's why we're so grateful for the expertise that will be showcased over the next 3 days. So time's running, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce the address by Minister Eamon Ryan. I want to sincerely thank him and his department for this engagement. And immediately after the video, you will see my colleague Cillian McMahon on the screen, and he will be introducing you to the speakers and the panel.
Good afternoon. I'm really glad to be able to join this Business in the Community session on the environmental, social and governance requirements we have for all new businesses now, particularly in relation to this critical issue of climate change. I suppose I'm particularly glad to be welcoming the paper, your science-based reporting and targets on tackling climate change coming from the Business Community Group. I think it's really important, timely, and fits in correctly with what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Ireland, and hopefully what's going on in the world as we head towards the 5th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement. That agreement, in my mind, provides the legal framework for everything else. I remember when it was signed 5 years ago now in Paris, and I remember one of the negotiators the night before saying, I hope it stays long, that it isn't shortened, because in a sense it is a legal document. And the legal text, while it's not committing any one country to any one reduction, it sets out the framework within which that has to be done. And I think it is based on the science. Core principle, that core trying to maintain a temperature increase below 1.5 degrees, sets in train a whole series of assessments about what would the science say is needed to make that a probability. So the work you're doing and the way you're approaching it and those science-based targets, I think is the correct way to go. That influenced our own party. We entered into a programme for government talks earlier this year with the demand, best way of putting it, that we would set ourselves a goal as a country of halving emissions by 2030. It's roughly a 7% per annum on average reduction in emissions that is required to achieve that objective. But that's the objective we get from the science, from that paper in 2018 from the IPCC, saying that is the sort of level of reduction we will need for developed countries to do if we're to have a chance of meeting that goal in the Paris Climate Agreement. So it wasn't politics, it was science that drove it. I was really glad that our colleagues in government, and indeed other parties, but particularly our colleagues in government now, agreed to buy into that level of ambition. And there should be no clouding the fact that it is actually hugely ambitious, because we have to catch up with some of our neighbouring countries who are ahead of us in the reductions that have been done. We have probably a bigger leap, a bigger change to make that halving of emissions by 2030 possible. But I'm convinced it's going to be good for us. It's going to be good for us as a country. We're going to be good at it, and it's going to be good for business. We will be able to do this, as huge challenge as it is, and one of the outcomes from it is we will develop a new economy which will create a lot of jobs, which will create a lot of investment opportunities and create security, including economic security, as well as environmental security for our state. To put it in context, as I said earlier, of the European context, we have to look at that, because I believe Europe this autumn, before the end of the year, before the end of the German presidency, will agree a reduction target in emissions by 2030 of at least 55%. You'll have seen very recently the European Parliament has set a higher target, 60% reduction, and I would support that higher level of ambition, because I agree with what Frans Timmermans says, that those countries, or indeed those continents who do this quickly and early, will see the lowest cost and the most economic benefit from it. Whether it's 55% or 60%, that'll be decided at the European Council. And as I said, for our country, whichever the figure, we're still going to have a huge challenge, because we are committing to effect a 50% overall reduction in emissions in just 10 short years. That will be turned into European law, at the same time that we're devising climate legislation here. The Climate Amendment Bill we've just published sets out the stepping stones that we'll take towards meeting that 2030 target and the 2050 target for a carbon neutral economy. Okay, halving in the next decade and then removing fossil fuels, going carbon neutral completely by 2050. There's never been a change or challenge like it, but it's one I believe that we would be well up to. In the business community, I think there's a number of pointers at the moment that help steer us in the right direction. Firstly, the agreement across the government parties and in the Joint Oireachtas Committee for us to steadily increase the price of carbon in the next 10 years to €100 a tonne will help you get the investment certainty I think you need to start preparing for that, planning for that. Secondly, in the areas of retrofitting and offshore wind particularly, there's two areas for huge economic opportunity for this state: to create efficiencies in a more productive economy and to create a power supply that will be secure well into the future, and will develop not just a renewable energy industry here, but also give us the clean power supplies that will help run other businesses, particularly any business relying on digital technologies, relying on the cloud or data centres, to know that your power will be coming from a renewable zero carbon source. Those huge investments are just two of the changes we need to make. You all know, you're working in this space, the scale of what needs to be done. The revolution that's taking place as we electrify transport and heating and balance this world where we have both a variable power supply and variable demand. That's where the economic opportunities are going to lie. That's where our skills already exist. And that's why I want to encourage you to keep following the science, to act as business and community with the environmental, social and governance standards that actually are in tune with this new economic model. It has to be a just transition. As Frans Timmermans says, there will be no transition if it does not happen this way. But it also requires enterprise. It requires the creativity that you will bring and the expertise you will bring to meet these scientific targets. I look forward to working with you in the coming 4 years, I hope, to deliver it, to set us on the right path, to play our part on this great global goal we are setting ourselves.
I'd like to thank Minister Ryan for that address and endorsing our report. So my name is Cillian McMahon. I'm a Corporate Responsibility Advisor with Business in the Community Ireland. So as the name of this webinar series suggests, it's beyond the rhetoric. There are a lot of terms, definitions out there around climate change in business, science-based targets, scope 1, 2, 3, etc. And a lot of people get bogged down by them. They find them hard and difficult to understand. So the purpose of this business panel is to break them down the jargon into plain English for our audience. So if my panelists could turn on their cameras and mics. So in no particular order, I'd like to welcome Fiona Ball, who is the Director of the Bigger Picture at Sky. I'd also like to welcome Sarah Webster, who is Director of Sustainable Business at Britvic. And finally, Matt Kennedy, who is Associate Director of Carbon and Climate at Arup. Thank you all very much for joining this morning. So they're just kind of listening there just to Minister Ryan. My first question is about, investing in climate change in these times of economic uncertainty. So if I start with you, Fiona, Sky, it's a global telecommunications and media company, climate change and nature, not really the most material issues for you. But can you tell us a bit about why Sky has put a large emphasis on both reducing their own environmental impact, but also in advocacy on environmental issues through your Sky Nature and Sky Zero campaigns.
Yeah, of course. So Sky's been in this for a long time. You know, we decided to go carbon neutral for our direct business, which is Scope 1 and 2, back in 2006, and start measuring and finding ways that we could reduce our impact on the environment. But as you say, we're not a massive carbon emissions producer. But where we do have a real opportunity is as a broadcaster is really to engage our customers across Europe and also engage our supply chain. We have about 11,000 suppliers in our supply chain, so quite a lot of businesses. In understanding the need to act on climate change, the immediacy of how we need to act and what people could do to join in and basically reduce our emissions. So ever since 2006, we've looked at ways that as a broadcaster and a platform that we could engage businesses, policymakers and our customers in understanding the issues of climate change and how they can join in through big campaigns that we've run. So we've run campaigns on Sky Rainforest Rescue, which was a big partnership with WWF around looking at the importance of protecting our rainforests across the world. Then we went to Sky Ocean Rescue, which we launched in 2017, which is obviously really important because the health of our oceans is critical. They're a massive sink in terms of carbon, and we need our oceans to be healthy. So we ran a campaign, and we're still running that campaign now, around looking at supporting our ocean health, particularly through the lens of reducing single-use plastics. And now we're running our campaign around Sky Zero. And Sky Zero is a mixture of our ambition as a large European business and the need for us to set clear science-based targets around our climate. And so we've set an ambition to be net zero carbon across all our value chain, which includes our Scope 1 and 2 in our direct business, but also the impact in our Scope 3. And our Scope 3 or value chain includes our supply chain and the use of our products in customer homes. This is all science-based, and so to get away from the jargon, basically it means that in order to stay below 1.5 degrees warming, which is what the Paris Agreement has set is the most important thing, we need to reduce across all of those scopes our carbon emissions as a business by 50%, and then start and continue to do that in the next 10 years. But net zero carbon means at that point, we will also start balancing through absorption in natural carbon sinks as well. So we do have quite a large carbon footprint. When you have a look, any organization, when you have a look across your whole value chain, when you start taking into account the footprint that you have in producing your service with your customers in the use of your products, and also the 11,000 suppliers across internationally, our footprint is 2 million tons of carbon, which is actually quite significant and is much bigger than just our direct business. Our direct business is 100,000 tons, it's only 5% of our footprint. The reason why we need to do it now is that the science really clearly shows in the next 10 years it's going to be critical for us to all halve our emissions in absolute terms. The sooner we start that, the better. In terms of, you know, addressing these things as part of the business, but it also gives us a huge opportunity as well. We kind of proved when we went out with Sky Ocean Rescue, we set ourselves a target to be single-use plastic free in the whole of our value chain by the end of this year, and we're meeting that target. We're just about 98% there now. We've got a couple of months left. COVID has kind of disrupted a few things in terms of single-use plastic creeping into our business, but we're sorting that one through. But what it did do was really help us. It was a big, ambitious target, and we knew we needed to think differently. We needed to design products differently. We need to transform our business, and that's what all this is about now. And that's why we've set a really ambitious target, because we need to transform.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I really like that kind of tying in with nature, and that's what we're seeing, you know, that like, you know, you can't do carbon by itself. You really is climate is very dependent on nature and is acting as a carbon sink, as you mentioned. So if I ask Sarah, you know, the hospitality sector has been decimated by the ongoing restrictions from the COVID-19 crisis. So, and I know as a drinks manufacturer, you are particularly exposed to the pub and restaurant trade. But like, can you tell me, why does Britvic still feel the need to pursue their target of net zero carbon by 2050?
Thanks, Cillian. I mean, fundamentally, it's the right thing to do, and we all have a role to play, as Fiona said, in addressing the environmental and social challenges that are facing the world today and in the future, and particularly in a post-COVID world. It falls to us in business to rebalance and in many cases repair the environmental and social inequality, because as the Minister said, we have the innovative and entrepreneurial spirit and the resources to make a difference. So, I mean, there is no question. We have to simply do it. And our Healthier People, Healthier Planet strategy is the key tenet of our 2025 business strategy, and it's fundamental to Britvic's resilience and future success as we create a better tomorrow, which is at sort of the heart of our purpose. And we are going to be impacted as a business by climate change, and we need to address it. I mean, the availability and quality of resources, the availability and quality of water are just two of the challenges that we face. And that is why we signed up to the 1.5 degree pathway for the science-based targets last year. And that involves us reducing our direct emissions by 50%, and our indirect emissions, which is about 90% of our value chain, by 35% by 2025, and of course carbon neutrality by 2050. And I come back to that point of resilience again. The most successful companies in 5 to 10 years' time are going to be the most sustainable companies, and we have to do it. It's a business imperative.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. And if I go over to Matt, so I think Eamon Ryan there spoke about the many opportunities related to do with climate investments. And in the last few months, there's been a lot of talk about a green recovery and stimulus funds, and a lot of green string attached. For example, I know Air France, one of the conditions from getting the bailout from the French government is they have to halve their carbon emissions by 2030. So from your experience, Matt, what role can climate smart solutions play in getting us out of this recession?
Okay, thanks, Killian. So firstly, Arup, as designers in the built environment, we feel that we have a role to play in mitigating the impact on the systems, but also enabling the infrastructure and enabling urban development to adapt to that change. That's why we've set science-based targets. That's why we've made a commitment to be net zero by 2030. So this is all really about providing a clear pathway for the company to align itself with the goals of the Paris Agreement that the Minister discussed, but also align ourselves with climate science. So when you talk about what smart solutions can play, it's really all about transformative change. So it's about building resilience, it's about closing emissions gaps, it's about aligning targets, it's about achieving ecological stability. So these are all the components about why you would invest in these low carbon solutions or these smart solutions at the moment. But it's not just about the solutions, it's really about the role that they will play. So the impact of the investment in the solutions, whether it's about cutting emissions or reducing pollution, whether it's about providing more accessibility to sustainable transport, enhancing climate neutrality, as people have said. But in many ways, from an industry perspective, it's about more the development of more sustainable, environmental, respectful products, services, more cycles, more sustainable food systems. It's very easy to see the impact of these type of solutions in terms of the energy system. And the Commission have announced earlier this month €1 billion for more investment in electricity markets. So really, it's about that type of change. And that type of investment is about supporting innovation, building competitiveness within industry, providing healthier environments that are not just about decarbonisation, but also the adaptation perspective, building more resilient communities and having more nature-based solutions. And environmental retrofitting in the built environment plays a large role in this, but so does biodiversity, so does sustainable agriculture, sustainable mobility, and generally clean energy itself. So it's the full suite of different sectoral areas that need to be tackled, but tackled ultimately to respond and present a pathway that companies like Arup and the other companies within Business in the Community Ireland can align themselves with the science and actually deliver on the Paris Agreement goals.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think all three of my panelists have spoken about science-based targets. So, let's try to demystify science-based targets for Irish business. So basically, over 1,000 companies have now signed up to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But basically, in a nutshell, in order to reach, as you say, well below 2 degrees pre-industrial levels and strive for 1.5 degree reduction, they tell you, this is what you need to do. So obviously, we in Business in the Community Ireland really encourage companies to get involved. So if I go to you first again, Fiona, just very simply, what top 3 pieces of advice would you give to Irish companies who are considering setting science-based targets?
So I think the first piece of advice that I would give is to really understand what your carbon emissions are across all of your scopes, because businesses have been very much concentrating on scopes 1 and 2, our direct business impact. And the difference here is that the scope has expanded to a whole value chain, so it does include the indirect emissions you have, and that's a really important bit, because a lot of the focus for businesses might not necessarily be, although it's a really important bit and needs to be reduced to 0, might not necessarily be their direct business, but how they engage with their customers or their supply chain, and that will influence on where the strategy heads to. So the one piece of advice I would say is get some support in understanding and measuring your carbon footprint across all 3 scopes, and be very transparent about what that is as well. We've been reporting what our scope 3 emissions are for a number of years, and are now really comfortable, because there's less accuracy in it, when you're starting to look at your supply chain emissions, but be really comfortable that you understand what those emissions are. I would say the second thing is actually to reach out to other businesses. Because when you're looking at scope 3 emissions, we're talking about 33% of our emissions are from our supply chain, our 11,000 suppliers. Now, 300 of those are the most carbon intensive. So for us, we know who to really engage with to start having the conversations about, setting of targets and how we can support them reduce emissions. We have an awful lot of suppliers and medium-sized companies within our supply chain as well. And engaging with them and having a conversation with them is going to be critical for us getting to net 0, and can also support other businesses. So the second thing I would say is reach out to other large businesses that have made a commitment around net 0 carbon and see how they can help you and support you. We're more than happy to share our process and our measurement with others. This is a collective, it's not a competitive issue. We all need to get there, and pretty fast. And then the third thing is once you be really ambitious with your target, because this is exactly what Matt said. This is about transformation and innovation. We're not going to get there with incremental changes. So it's really important to set an ambitious target and to really look at right from the outset the governance of this within the business. It's not ownership from a CSR or sustainability team. This has to be really embedded across the business, and everybody has to understand the role that they're going to make. So they're the 3 things I would say.
Excellent, thanks. And yes, and here in Business Community Ireland, that's the whole kind of goal of the pledge, is really about collaboration. And I might ask you kind of similar question to yourself too, Sarah. So obviously, obviously in the food and drink sector, there's a complicated supply chain as well. So can you tell us a bit about what initiatives you're undertaking with your supply chain to reduce their footprint, carbon footprint?
Absolutely, and I think completely echo Fiona's points. The first start point is getting the data so that you know where your base is. And we actually got some external consultants to help us with this a couple of years ago, and we're about to go through the next wave of that as well. And from that, we can then identify our hotspots. So within our indirect impact, our hotspots, as you would expect, are ingredients, packaging, logistics and distribution, and it's capital goods and equipment, which involves, all of the chillers that we see in outlets that are keeping our drinks cool. And then with that, you have an understanding of where you need to focus. We all have, lots of suppliers within the supply chain, but there are, if you apply the 80-20 rule, it makes it far more manageable. So break it down into those steps and make sure you're focusing where you think you can work with your suppliers to, have the greatest impact. And we're now, you know, starting to use a carbon calculator as well in our conversations as we're assessing different supply options in our supply chain. The next piece, and again, Fiona touched on this, is all about engagement. So a couple of months ago, we conducted our supplier survey, and this, together with the new Scope 3 information, will form the basis of our dialogue with our suppliers going forward, and that will involve, you know, developing a carbon reduction plan between us. Clearly, we will recommend that they also sign up for science-based targets and disclose to CDP. And that is going to be sort of a fundamental sort of collective responsibility as we move forward. And specifically, you know, what are we doing on one of our hotspots? So packaging, Fiona talked about it. Sky are aiming to go plastic free. There is no silver bullet, so it does require a number of approaches. And the first one of those for us, you know, delighted to see last week that Ballygowan is now in 100% rPET in the 500 ml, and this is the sort of the beginning of a whole year's program to really make that brand even more sustainable than it is. You know, it's a great Irish product, Irish spring water in recycled PET. And one of the challenges with recycled PET is you need good quality flake. So we have invested last year £5 million with a PET recycler, and they do bottling, and they create the recycled flake as well in ester form. And this is giving us a guaranteed supply of recycled PET, good quality recycled PET, that we can then feed into our bottles. There's also a case of taking packaging out, so lightweighting. We've taken over 2,000 tonnes of packaging out over the last 3 years, and you know, that combined with the Ballygowan programme, you know, we'll be taking 150 million virgin plastic bottles from Ireland's environment over the next 3 years. But we're talking about system change as well, and we've also got to think about, you know, really completely turn on its head the delivery of soft drinks, and our London Essence Fresh Serve is a great example of that, and it is a solution where the pack delivers 1,000 serves through a fantastic Fresh Serve font, and that's taking 1,000 bottles for each pack out of the system. So really no silver bullet, but we're all, you know, it's a whole portfolio of solutions that we're working towards.
Excellent. Yeah, and great to hear about those innovations at Britvic. And speaking about innovation, if I go back to Matt, you know, just listening there to Eamon Ryan about like the different, talking about the retrofitting and renewable energy. So, you know, obviously, you know, technology will play a key role in helping businesses to achieve their science-based targets. So, you know, just from your experience, what's happening in the world these days, what are the key kind of technological trends and developments that will help businesses to cut their carbon emissions?
Thanks, Cillian. Yeah, so the first thing I would say, I would agree with everything that Fiona and Sarah have talked about in terms of baseline. So for a company to understand their data and their situation today in terms of their performance and where they want to go to, by what time, and what are their goals. So for Arup, as I mentioned, we had agreed, we have an agreed target of net zero by 2030, and understanding really what that means. Internally, but also with our clients. We, as a methodology in terms of understanding that, we put an internal price on carbon. So we increased carbon by an extra 40 euro per tonne as a way of measuring the impact. What we've also done is we've looked at the approach in terms of, so Arup has 16,000 staff. We're in different regions. You can't apply a similar approach across all regions, just the nature of supply chains and that. So what are the targets at a regional level? So we looked at what the Commission have done on their national determined contributions, and actually we established regionally determined contributions. So we broke our footprint up into regions. The next thing in terms of the technology trends, it's really about each industry has a different footprint. So you can apply similar approaches, but we looked at what's called control and influence. We can control our direct emissions, but also we have influence and an impact in the projects that we are engaging with. In terms of the technologies themselves, let me give you an example of how you would approach it at a sectoral basis. It's sometimes easier for companies to translate action into sectors. So we looked at energy, we looked at waste, we looked at travel, and we looked at purchasing. So, and determined clear metrics and targets by each of those sectors. And I'll just touch on a few of them. Say, for example, in energy, it's about understanding where you want to get to. So do you own the building, or are you do you own your energy contract? Are you a tenant and renting the building? So these things matter in terms of setting your goals. Our offices, our goal is that there would be 100% powered by renewable energy by 2023. We will reduce 30% of our emissions by 2025 and then be net zero by 2030. And then often if you control your energy contract, you can move into things like PPAs and different types of instruments in terms of that. In terms of things like purchasing, which is a large issue in terms of getting to delivering on the science-based targets. That involves supply chain analysis, where, for a company like Arup, it's around where your IT comes from, your food, your office supplies. So it's about engaging with suppliers to get an understanding of that and reducing the emissions of goods and services from the top suppliers that companies engage with. And then in terms of travel, which is, a global footprint company like Arup, it's about reducing business travel. So we've set goals to reduce business travel by 50%. If people are traveling for business, the protocol now is to use electric vehicles. So again, reducing the emissions. We put together an office travel plan. We've put together health and well-being initiatives and stimulating behavioral change around the way that the staff engage with travel in their daily lives. And then finally, waste, which is a big push towards circular economy, reuse and resource efficiency. And that's that type of procurement strategy around waste. These are the things that we're trying to push forward. The final thing I would talk really about is, so these technology trends are very related to your jurisdiction, your company, and where your emissions are coming from. So if you feel that one of the aspects from an innovation perspective, we've invested in a carbon fund in terms of selecting gold standard certification projects in areas where we feel that, say, for example, if we had a European board meeting, we've offset offset those emissions in terms of a gold standard project with utilizing biogas. We've looked at how you would measure progress, how you adjust greenhouse gas emission goals, and done internal calls for proposals within Arup to come up with new ideas in terms of carbon reduction and offsetting. So look at the company that you have, look where your emissions are across the 3 different types of scopes, and ultimately put together a plan based on your baseline about how you can get to an emissions target by a particular date.
That's great, Matt. That's really good advice. Okay, so we were less than 5 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of rapid fire questions. So just go back to you again, Fiona. Matt talked there about the different stakeholders. I know that Sky has a large employee base and customer base. So, any advice for companies how to engage them, in their carbon initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for hours on this, because for us, this is our opportunity as a broadcaster, and it's a really important part of us getting there is to take the public and to take our suppliers and other businesses along the task with us. That's why we're using our content, our news channels, our sporting partners to really engage people. And it's important to engage people that aren't necessarily the sustainability believers as well. Everybody needs to come on this journey. But I would say just one thing, it can be really broken down into 5 really easy things that everybody needs to do and get behind. It's around, as Matt says, renewable energy. It's about looking at the options to switch to renewables. It's around the built environment and efficiency. It's about our transportation, zero emissions transport. It's about the food that you eat, because that has a massive part to play. And it really key is the nature. We need to invest in rewilding and our biodiversity. That's going to be a massive part in balancing the net zero piece, having natural carbon sinks restored. So there
Excellent,
we go.
yeah. And just very quickly to Sarah, and I know this year Britvic took out a 400 million sustainability linked loan from Rabobank. So can you just tell our audience briefly why this is important to Britvic and how you're using this finance?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I ought to say is that it isn't designated specifically for sustainable projects. It's part of our ongoing rotating credit facility. And I think that is a great signal in itself, because it just goes to show how important Britvic takes this and how embedded the people, planet and performance lens is being taken across our whole business. And it's worked very well. It's gone down very well with, lots of our stakeholders, investors, the people actually who are behind the bond, and our employees. Being a sustainable business is fundamentally important for our employees, our customers, our consumers, and I think this is just one step of demonstrating how embedded it is now, and how important it is to move beyond the rhetoric. Just quickly as well, we're also just coming to the end of our stakeholder materiality research, which looks across stakeholders, suppliers, a lot of the NGOs and charities that we're working with as well. And the key things coming out of there, as you'd expect, there's packaging, especially plastic, there's carbon emissions, supply chain water, biodiversity, which Fiona has talked about, and sugar, all at the front of our stakeholders' minds. And it just goes to show the importance of collaboration across all of our stakeholders to solve these issues. And it's great, some of the feedback that we've had from suppliers about us reaching out to engage with them on this, and it just makes those partnerships much stronger as well. So it's better for everybody.
Great, and it's going to quickly short. And unfortunately, Matt, we won't have to go to the last question, but I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time. And there's some really fantastic advice there for our member companies. So now I would like to hand over to Charlotte and Thibault from our research partners, Quantis. And they were involved in our newly launched report, Progressing Towards Science-Based Targets, which examines the readiness of Irish business to fully reduce their carbon emissions.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for being with us today. I'm Charlotte Bande, Global Head of Climate Strategy at Quantis International. Quantis is a sustainability consultancy that helps our partners transition towards more sustainable business models through metrics, tools, strategies, and communications. I'm really happy to be here with my colleague Thibault to present to you the results of our collaboration with BITCI around the Low Carbon Pledge. The report outlines the great work that has already been achieved by some signatories members, as well as provide guidance towards for anyone who would want to start a science-based climate strategy journey. But before we dive into the report, let's take a step back. Why are we talking about science-based targets, and what do they actually mean? Well, climate change is one of the most important topics of our time. And while we were hoping that 2020 would be a critical turning point in the fight against climate change, I believe none of us expected the extent to which it would be. In late 2018, the IPCC released its 1.5 degree report as commissioned by the Paris Agreement. While this report outlined the consequences of not reaching a 1.5 degree world, it also showed us the way to get there. And the conclusions are pretty straightforward. We need to halve our emissions by 2030 compared to 2010 and reach net zero by 2050. Now, the reality is we're not on track. If we look at the data, with all the current pledges that we have in place from governments and companies, we will be lucky if we manage to stabilize our emissions by 2030. So we really need to up our ambitions, and companies will play a critical role in this ambitious rise. The good news is, however, is that setting science-based goals is not only good for the planet, it's good for companies and businesses as well. Firstly, it shows leadership. Any companies that has set such targets is being recognized either by investors, employees, new talents, or even customers as really making a change. Secondly, it will help mitigating risks and future risks that will come. We know that going beyond 1.5 degree will lead to consequences that will be extremely difficult for companies, supply chains, populations to absorb. So making sure that we reduce our emissions is also about ensuring long-term risks. And this plays nicely into the next one, actually, the sustainable business growth. There's an increasing pressure around resources availability. There's also a lot of pressure from customers who want to change the way they're consuming and going towards more sustainable companies. And finally, it's also about gaining value chain efficiencies. So all of this will really enable you to become more resilient in the long term. Setting climate goals, especially ambitious ones, will also help drive innovation, because you're putting a constraint on your company and you have to figure out ways to get there. We've seen it over the past few years. Innovation linked to sustainability has just been a significant rise lately. And finally, internal engagement. This is something through the work that I've been doing with companies around the topic that has struck me the most. The power of working with your employees towards setting those goals, identifying action plans and developing those is really incredible. Now that I've talked about why it's important to set ambitious goals, the thing is, we're not sure yet what they are. So the first point I want to make here is that when we're talking about science-based goals, we're talking about setting targets and reductions targets that are in line with 1.5 degree. And why do I emphasize that reduction piece? Is that we're in a world where net zero goals are becoming the new normal, and a lot of these net zero goals will rely heavily on offsets. The truth is, offsets will not be sufficient to get us to a 1.5 degree world, so reductions are really critical. The second thing about science-based targets is that they differ quite a lot from the way we used to set targets. In the business world or previous sustainability goals, we used to say, what's the benchmark doing? Look at other companies or figure out what we think is achievable. And we would set our targets accordingly, even if they were seemed ambitious. Nowadays, what we're looking at is not what can be achieved, but what needs to be achieved and by when to keep operating within a safe space. So in short, doing what's achievable is replaced by asking what's needed and how do we get there. And it's going to be a process. The first thing you need to know is you need to understand what are your environmental impacts. So looking at your baseline. And this has to be done on your entire value chain, so from the extraction of raw materials until the end of life of your products. This will help identify hotspots and key drivers. Once you know that, you can then set a reduction target aligned with the science-based targets frameworks, which will give you the pace at which you need to be reducing. And then identify the building blocks that will get you there. Finally, you will reach a gap. There will be a gap to reach your targets, and this is where innovation will have to come into play. Why do I say there will be a gap? Is that while low-hanging fruits and incremental changes might get you to the next 5 years milestone, it will for sure not be sufficient to achieve the reductions that are required by 2030 or by 2050. 1.5 goals will require every company to go beyond these incremental improvements and move towards disruptive innovation and business model changes. And this is not an easy or straightforward journey. It's not going to happen overnight, and there's not just a one-size-fits-all approach. So because of that, it's raising a lot of questions, and this is something you need to take time and look into. What we're hoping is that the report we've worked with, the BITCI, will bring some of the answers you might be looking for, or help you draft the questions that you need to ask yourselves to start that journey. I will now leave the floor to my colleague Thibault, who will go over the results of our report with you.
Thank you, Charlotte, and hi everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today to share this great piece of work that we've put together with Business in the Community Ireland and valuable help from the members. We are really proud to make this piece of work available to all Irish business starting today. As you may know, by signing the Low Carbon Pledge, members have committed to reduce their direct emissions drastically by 2030. But as science and global targets are quickly evolving, and with the call for climate action getting bigger than ever, BITCI is looking to increase the ambition of its Low Carbon Pledge. Indeed, measuring only direct emission is no longer sufficient. We need to measure indirect value chain emissions. We need to assess them and account them for. This report, Progressing Towards Science-Based Targets, has been developed in this context in order to support and help businesses identify and tackle their value chain emissions and move towards setting science-based targets. We strongly believe that this report will be a stepping stone for Irish business to embark on this journey and make meaningful contributions to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. The main objectives of the report are as follows. Firstly, it aims to set a baseline of where current pledge signatories stands with regard to understanding and measuring the indirect emissions, what we call Scope 3 emissions, as well as where they stand regarding setting science-based targets. The second objective is to provide a clear picture of the global best practices in Scope 3 reporting and reduction pathways. Based on its findings, it presents recommended action and guidance to support companies in their efforts. As Charlotte said, reducing emission is not an easy or straightforward journey, and there's no clear path forward. For the majority of companies, there are many questions that remain unanswered. How can we get started? How can we locate, material sources of emission across my value chain? How can I measure and set meaningful targets? Today, Quantis is delighted to share the fruit of this amazing collaborative effort with business in the community and its members to provide Irish business with answers to these questions. As I mentioned, the first step of this research was to understand where Irish business stand regarding indirect emission assessment. Using a questionnaire, we asked 42 respondents. As I mentioned, the first step of this research was to understand where Irish business stand regarding indirect emission assessments. Using a questionnaire, we asked 42 respondents questions about their understanding of indirect value chain emissions and their progress towards assessing these Scope 3 emissions. We really want to thank all participating companies for taking the time to answer our questions and chat with us and provide great and useful insights into the struggles and their climate journeys. It's been very insightful and has helped a lot in the design of this work. What stands out is that 71% of companies are already assessing their Scope 3 emissions. This is good and this is great, but we need to get this number to 100%. As we know, for most companies, Scope 3 makes the most of a company's impact, so we need to get all companies to start assessing these Scope 3 emissions. Regarding the main categories assessed and the main sources of emission assessed, we can see here the top three, and this makes sense as they are the most straightforward to assess and measure. However, they're usually not the most material categories of sources of emission for most companies, and it's important to consider these other categories which might make up for most of your indirect emission as well. The lack of guidance, especially for the finance sector, for example, is one of the reasons these categories are less reported on, and we hope that time and better understanding will help get these numbers up, and this report is part of this. Charlotte has highlighted the business case behind assessing and measuring these Scope 3 emissions, as well as setting science-based goals. The main focus of this research was to understand what was slowing or blocking this process, what was keeping companies from assessing the Scope 3 emissions. The main barriers to Scope 3 assessments raised by respondents were first the lack of guidance, especially for companies just starting in this process. The lack of guidance is critical. The complexity of Scope 3 assessment can often discourage you. Not knowing where to start, who to engage on, or how to measure specific emission have all been highlighted as limiting factors. This report provides useful information, but keep in mind that it's a field that is rapidly evolving and guidance is rapidly evolving. And the Science Based Target Initiative, for example, is releasing sectoral guidances as we speak. So hopefully more guidance will come your way pretty soon. The second barriers that was raised was data access and supply chain engagement. For most of the respondents, the complexity of the value chain is a key barrier. A complex value chain also results in difficulties obtaining quality data. Engaging with suppliers is critical in order to solve these issues. And finally, the last barriers was definitely time, resources, and leadership buy-in and internal engagement. The corporate footprint process requires times and resources, and that are not always at the disposal of the reporting team. This highlights the importance of internal engagement and leadership buy-in in order to implement an effective climate strategy and an effective emission assessment across the entire company. So yes, the core of this report has been articulated around these three main barriers and try to provide answers on how to overcome these barriers. So basically the end goal of measuring indirect emission is to set robust and meaningful science-based reduction objectives. So one of the other objectives of this report was to understand where members stand with regard to setting SBTs. Some companies have already set or submitted SBTs and others have already internal targets. However, so loads of companies don't have targets at all, and some only have set targets for the Scope 1 and 2. And we know that one of the reasons why is the lack of guidance. So the report tries to bring some clarity into all of this. I'm not going to deep dive into the specifics of science-based targets right now, but you can find all this information in the report. What I wanted to bring to your attention is the general 4-step process to set science-based targets that we can see here. We discussed internal engagement and leadership buy-in, and it's right there in step 1. This process starts with a commitment letter from the CEO, which sends a really strong signal internally and helps engaging people internally across the entirety of the company. Step 2 is all about defining targets. This process is carefully explained and broken down in the report in order to help companies make sense of all of this. This report also offers some tools and links to specific guidance in order to best equip businesses to set meaningful targets. The general recommendation provided on Scope 3 assessment and SBT provides us a strong basis to engage on the path towards setting science-based reduction targets. However, as it's been mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all strategy, and this highlights the importance of increasing the granularity of the assessments to the sectorial level. So for this purpose, 5 sectorial guidance sheets have been developed in the report. They provide information, guidance, and recommendations for companies within these 5 sectors. The global aim of these guidance sheets is to start providing answers to the questions and help companies get a good head start on setting science-based targets. Nonetheless, even if the information provided will guide companies to help them locate material sources of emission across their supply chain, for example, these guidelines will not be a perfect fit for everyone. Indeed, every company is different, and thus every climate strategy and emission assessments should be tailored and adapted to each company's needs, characteristics, and ambition. So what's next? This report is really a stepping stone and a guide to help get companies get to the next level. However, setting science-based targets alone is not enough. More than ever, companies must act to reduce their impact and transitions to a sustainable business model. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees will require a drastic shift in the way companies work. A full and comprehensive climate strategy is necessary if we want to achieve our global goals. As we mentioned, and Charlotte mentioned this before, a comprehensive carbon emission assessment offers valuable insights, enabling companies to identify major emission hotspots and the drivers, as well as identify key levers for meaningful action. Furthermore, a strong emission baseline, including indirect emission and a deeper understanding of the entire value chain, will allow companies not only to address low-hanging fruits, but to address also more deeply embedded issues. But designing a roadmap is not enough. We need to act, and we need to implement effective solutions to reach these objectives, and you can't do it alone. Engaging with your suppliers, but there's also with key stakeholders downstream and all across your value chain, basically, and encouraging them to take part and follow you along in your climate journey is absolutely critical. And this is one of the reasons why we want to make this report public and available to all Irish business. Only by working together we will achieve Ireland's reduction objectives. That's it for our part. We're really excited on behalf of Quantis to share this report with Irish business today. We want to thank the ITCI once again for the amazing collaboration throughout the entire process and the great work that they do to support Irish companies embark on their climate journey. We really hope that you'll get the most out of this report and that it will help you on your way to decarbonising your operations and your value chain.
Okay. I first and foremost want to, I have to bring this to a close, but apologize because the slides were quite fuzzy and we couldn't really see them. Just to let you know, the report is accessible on our website. We've put the link on the Q&A function as well, and the recording as well as the slides will be also made available to anybody who signed up this morning. So I do apologize because the report is it's very solid and it's a significant stepping stone in terms of where we're going. So 2 things I need to do to close. First and foremost, to thank our amazing speakers, Fiona, Sarah, and Matt. You really demystified for us 2 things this morning. One, that engaging in across your supply chain on carbon emissions is doable, and that COVID-19 has not stopped. On the contrary, your journey towards net zero. So thank you and congratulations. Thanks to the minister and his team. Thanks to my great colleague Cillian who put this event together. And the last thing to say is that the S and the G are coming. So 2 more sessions tomorrow and Friday. Tomorrow we'll be talking about real inclusion. and what's the role of business in real inclusion. And on Friday, we're going to talk about governance, decision-making and sustainability. So please do stay tuned if you haven't signed up yet. And 2 more dates for your diary, because this doesn't finish. I'm delighted to announce we have an In Conversation webinar session with Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever, on the 12th of November. Very much looking forward to that conversation. And if you're good planners, put the 6th of October 2021 in your diaries, because that is our 20th, it'll be now 21st anniversary celebration and major conference. And I would really like to thank the companies that have come together to support us on this journey towards 2021, because the sustainability revolution is only starting. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a fantastic day.